Welcome to a deep dive into Balinese history and power structures.
Okay.
Specifically how the past continues to shape the island's present. You know, we were recently given this fascinating thesis by a student named Calvin.
Oh, wow.
And it really got us thinking.
Yeah.
His research on these power centers called Puri in Klungkung and Gianyar is like a keyhole into understanding how Bali works even today. Whether you're prepping for a trip, a meeting, or just satisfying your curiosity about this island. Buckle up.
What's captivating about Bali is how its image as a paradise often overshadows its complex history. Calvin's research helps us understand how power has flowed and shifted through the ages.
Wow.
It's not just temples and beaches. It's a living story.
So to really get this, we need to rewind the clock. Way back. Imagine Bali 2,000 years ago.
Wow.
Humming with activity along trade routes, stretching all the way to India and China.
Think spice traders and silk merchants.
Oh, what?
Ideas flowing along with goods. And the evidence isn't just speculation. Archaeological digs have uncovered skeletons and artifacts that point to direct contact with India.
Wow.
Centuries before written records.
That's amazing.
Even began here.
So we've got proof of this ancient connection. But what was Bali like before all these outside influences?
Even then, Bali wasn't isolated.
Okay.
There are these incredible Simbaran inscriptions, copperplate edicts dating back to the 10th century. They depict a sophisticated society, a glimpse into their political landscape with specialized roles and systems of governance.
Wow.
It's like cracking a code to understand their world.
Okay, so Bali's got this long history of trade, complex society, then bam. The Majapahit Empire arrives in 1343,
A major power shift.
Talk about shaking things up.
And this is where we meet the Baliyaga. These communities, for various reasons, held on to their distinct cultural practices. They resisted the Majapahit influence.
Wow.
Almost like pockets of cultural resilience against this massive empire.
And what's the story with Simbiran?
Simbiran is a fascinating example.
You mentioned that earlier.
It's a village with both oral traditions and historical accounts.
Is that connected to the Baliyaga?
That tell a story of navigating power dynamics. You have refugees seeking asylum, the constant threat of pirates. It's a microcosm of the struggles and changes happening across Bali at the time.
Okay, so we've got ancient trade, complex social structures, a powerful empire arriving. Where did the Dutch fit into all of this?
Fast forward a few centuries, and the Dutch enter the scene, bringing a whole new set of rules to the game.
Wow.
They established their colonial presence, impacting trade, agriculture, and even the internal dynamics of Bali's noble houses.
Okay, so the Dutch weren't just stamping their feet and taking over.
And this wasn't always a straightforward takeover. It was a negotiation of power.
There was more to it than that.
Exactly. The concept of sinking status within noble houses is key here. Anthropologist Clifford Geertz described 19th century Bali as a theater state, where power was often performative and symbolic. Your lineage mattered, but so did your proximity to the ruling powers and your ability to maneuver politically.
So even under Dutch rule, Balinese society was figuring out how to maintain its own internal power structures. That's fascinating. But what about the everyday people?
That's where the Subex system comes in. It's this incredible irrigation system. But it's so much more than just water management. It's deeply tied to Balinese cosmology and their understanding of the balance between humans and nature.
So even the way they irrigated their fields.
It's a social and religious institution with its own hierarchy. From the water teams to the Serahan.
Wow.
A kind of water priest.
It was a reflection of their worldview and their social structures.
Precisely.
Wow.
And this brings us to the heart of Calvin's thesis. The Puri. These royal houses, particularly in Klungkung and Gianyar, provide a unique lens to examine how power operated in Bali. And what's amazing is that these Puri still wield influence today.
Okay, so let's dive into these Puris. I'm ready to unpack their stories. Where do we start?
Let's start with Klungkung.
Okay.
It was once the seat of the Dewa Agung, the paramount king of Bali.
Yeah.
So it's steeped in history and tradition. Even though that kingdom doesn't exist in the same way, the Puri of Klungkung still hold immense symbolic and cultural weight.
So it's like the echoes of that royal power still resonate even today.
Exactly.
But how does that play out in a modern context?
That's what's so intriguing about Calvin's research.
Okay.
He dug into Klungkung's political landscape in the late 20th and early 21st centuries.
Right.
A time of major change for Bali and Indonesia as a whole.
Yeah.
What he found is that even with modernization, the Puri of Klungkung continued to exert influence, just in a more subtle way.
So less about issuing royal decrees and more about navigating the intricacies of modern politics.
Exactly.
Okay.
Calvin focuses on Kakorda Gate Agung, the head of the Puri Agung Klungkung, as a key example.
Okay.
He was involved in politics, but not by holding public office himself.
Right.
He acted more as a kingmaker, influencing elections and supporting candidates aligned with his interests.
That's clever. He was a power player behind the scenes.
Precisely.
Shaping outcomes without getting directly involved in the messy world of partisan politics.
And this approach allowed him to maintain a degree of separation, ensuring the Puri's interests were represented without getting bogged down in the day-to-day political battles.
So he adapted to the changing rules of the game.
Exactly.
But how did this work in practice? Were political allegiances in Klungkung?
Often, yes.
Based on these historical ties to the Puri?
Different branches of the royal family supported different factions.
Oh, wow.
Which could lead to some pretty intense rivalries.
Yeah.
Especially during elections.
I bet family drama on a royal scale sounds like something out of a TV show.
There was definitely no shortage of intrigue.
Yeah.
Calvin even mentions a particularly heated election where Kakorda Gate Agung ended up at odds with some of his own relatives.
Wow, that's got to be awkward at family gatherings.
Yeah.
So Klungkung's got this legacy of royal power playing out in modern politics. What about Gianyar?
Gianyar was a different kind of power center. While it wasn't the seat of the paramount king like Klungkung, it still held significant influence. One of the things that stands out is how strategic marriages were used to solidify power.
The classic tale of marrying for political gain.
Right.
I could just picture these elaborate wedding ceremonies.
Absolutely.
Not just celebrations, but displays of power.
And in Bali, marriage isn't just a personal matter.
Right.
It has profound social and political implications.
Yeah.
Every union creates or strengthens alliances, shifting the balance of power.
It's like every wedding is a move on a chessboard.
Exactly.
Did Calvin find specific examples of this in Gianyar?
Yes.
Okay.
The story of Dewa Manggis II,
okay,
a king who rose to power in the 18th century, is a great example.
Okay.
He wasn't born into the most powerful lineage,
right,
but he used his political skills and, importantly, strategic marriages to climb the ranks.
He sounds like a real strategist.
Yeah.
Turning his disadvantages into advantages. How did he use marriage to gain power?
Dewa Manggis II married into influential families, forging key alliances.
Right.
He outmaneuvered his rivals.
Wow.
Eventually becoming one of Gianyar's most powerful rulers.
Okay.
It's like he saw the bigger picture, thinking generations ahead.
So he wasn't just thinking about his own reign.
Right.
But about how to secure his legacy and the influence of his descendants.
Exactly.
Wow.
He had multiple wives and many children, and he orchestrated their marriages to expand his web of alliances across the region.
Yeah.
His offspring became power players themselves, carrying his influence forward.
He created a dynasty.
Yeah.
A whole network of power stemming from his strategic choices. That's impressive. But did this kind of power structure last?
That's a key question.
How did the Puri of Gianyar adapt to the changes of the 20th century?
Just like we saw in Klungkung.
Especially with Indonesia becoming a modern democracy.
The Puri of Gianyar had to find new ways to exert influence. Okay.
Some members became involved in politics.
Right.
Working behind the scenes to support candidates and shape policies. They weren't ruling in the traditional sense.
Okay.
But they were still very much players in the game.
So they had to find new levers of power, working within a very different system. But it sounds like their influence wasn't just about political maneuvering.
Right.
Didn't you mention something about Drew earlier.
You've got a good memory.
Yeah.
Drew is a key concept to understand how the Puri exerted power even beyond direct political involvement.
Right.
In Bali, land ownership isn't straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
Drew is less about owning land in the Western sense and more about a symbolic connection to divine authority.
Wow.
It mirrors the king's role as a representative of the gods.
That's fascinating. Yeah. So it's not just a legal document or a deed.
Exactly.
It's tied to a whole worldview, a spiritual connection to the land and to power. And this concept of Drew gave the Puri a kind of intangible authority, even as the formal structures of power shifted around them. They were still seen as guardians of tradition, upholding Balinese values. That holds a lot of weight in a society undergoing rapid modernization.
It's like their power is rooted in something deeper than just laws and politics.
You could say that.
It's connected to the very identity of Bali itself.
And this brings us to an important point raised by Calvin's thesis. He argues that this deep-rooted authority allowed the Puri to adapt to a changing world. They weren't just clinging to the past. They were finding ways to make their traditions relevant in a new context.
That's a powerful insight.
Yeah.
It challenges the idea that tradition and modernity are always at odds. It suggests that they can coexist, even reinforce each other.
Precisely.
Wow.
And this is where things get really interesting. Because Calvin doesn't just describe how the Puri adapted. He also points out some of the tensions that arose from this process.
So it wasn't all smooth sailing.
Definitely.
There were some bumps along the way.
One of the things Calvin highlights is the potential for a disconnect between the image the Puri projected and the reality of their actions.
So there's the public face of the Puri, the image of cultural authority, and then there's the behind-the-scenes maneuvering, the political and economic dealings that might not always align with that image.
Exactly. And Calvin's research encourages us to look beyond the surface, to question assumptions, and to consider multiple perspectives when analyzing the role of the Puri.
So even though they hold this symbolic power, we can't romanticize them. We have to be critical to examine the complexities of their influence.
And that's what makes Calvin's research so valuable. It doesn't just describe the historical dynamics. It gives us the tools to understand how those dynamics continue to play out in modern Bali.
So we've got these fascinating case studies of Klungkung and Gianyar, both revealing how the Puri have adapted and navigated power in different ways.
Exactly.
But what does this all tell us about the broader picture of Balinese society?
Well, it reinforces the idea that power is fluid and dynamic, constantly evolving and finding new forms of expression. Even in a place like Bali, steeped in tradition, power isn't static. It's constantly being negotiated and redefined.
So even as we see these historical forces at play, we also see how those forces are being shaped by the present moment.
And I think one of the most valuable takeaways from Calvin's research is that the story isn't over. The Puri, like all institutions, continue to evolve. Their future will depend on how they navigate the ongoing tension between tradition and modernity.
So they're caught in this balancing act.
Precisely.
Trying to preserve their cultural authority while also staying relevant in a rapidly changing world. It makes you wonder, how do the Balinese people themselves view the role of the Puri in their lives?
That's a great question.
Are they seen as relics of the past? Or as vital forces in shaping Bali's future?
And I think it's one that deserves further exploration because ultimately it's the people of Bali who will determine the fate of these traditions and institutions.
So we've got ancient kings, Dutch colonialism, strategic marriages, irrigation systems tied to cosmology, and these powerful Puri pulling strings behind the scenes. It's a lot to take in.
It is. But if there's one thing I hope you take away from this deep dive, it's that Balinese history and culture are inextricably linked to the dynamics of power.
And that understanding those dynamics is key to understanding Bali, both its past and its present. When we've been talking about these power dynamics, I keep thinking back to that idea of Bali as a theater state. Such a striking image.
It is a powerful metaphor, isn't it? It reminds us that power is often about performance and symbolism, carefully cultivating a certain image.
And it makes me wonder how much of that theatrical element is still present in Balinese politics today.
I think it's safe to say the theatricality hasn't entirely disappeared.
Right.
Balinese culture places a high value on aesthetics, ceremony, and presentation.
You see it everywhere, right?
Exactly.
The elaborate rituals, the vibrant costumes, the offerings.
Those elements are almost extensions of the theater state mentality.
Right.
Power isn't just about what you do, but how you present yourself.
Yeah.
How you communicate through symbolism and spectacle.
So even a political rally might have a touch of that dramatic flair.
Absolutely.
A sense of ceremony that goes beyond the practical.
And this connects back to Calvin's thesis.
Okay.
He touches on how this performative aspect of power can sometimes lead to a disconnect between image and reality.
So there's the carefully crafted public persona.
Precisely.
And then what's actually happening behind the scenes. Yeah. It's like that old saying, all that glitters is not gold.
Right. Yeah.
You can't just assume that what you see on the surface reflects the whole story.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's important to be aware of this potential gap between image and reality.
Right.
Don't just take things at face value. Dig deeper. Look beyond the surface and consider different perspectives.
So it's a reminder to be critical to question assumptions.
Yeah.
Especially when power is involved.
Absolutely.
And that tension between image and reality seems connected to another big theme we've touched on, tradition versus modernity.
Right.
Bali is often marketed as this haven of timeless beauty.
Yeah.
But it's also facing rapid modernization.
It's a tension playing out all over the world as cultures navigate globalization.
Right.
But it's especially potent in Bali, which attracts so many tourists seeking that authentic cultural experience.
Right. But the irony is that tourism itself is a driving force of modernization, changing the very thing it seeks to preserve.
And it's fascinating to see how this tension is reflected in the way the Puri operate.
Right.
They're seen as symbols of the past, but they also have to find ways to stay relevant in the present.
It's like walking a tightrope.
Exactly.
How do you honor tradition while also adapting to a changing world?
Right.
How do you preserve your cultural authority without becoming a relic?
Precisely.
Yeah.
And I think it's a challenge the Puri are facing with a mix of success and struggle.
Right.
There's no easy answer.
It makes you wonder, what does the future hold for the Puri?
Right. That's $1 million question.
Will they continue to wield influence?
Calvin's research provides a snapshot of a particular moment in time,
but
it also raises a host of questions about the future.
Right.
How will the Puri adapt to the challenges of the 21st century? What role will they play in a Bali that's increasingly connected to the global economy and facing issues like climate change and social inequality?
It feels like Bali is at a crossroads, facing some big questions about its identity and its future.
Absolutely. And Calvin's research, though, focused on these specific Puri, offers valuable insights into the broader dynamics at play in Balinese society. It's a reminder that power, culture, and history are all intertwined, and that understanding those connections is key to understanding Bali's complex and ever-evolving story.
So what are some of the key things you hope our listener takes away from this deep dive?
Well, I think the first is to appreciate the depth and complexity of Balinese history and culture.
Right.
It's so much more than just beautiful beaches and temples. There are layers upon layers of tradition, ritual, and power dynamics that shape the island's present. Second, I hope this deep dive has highlighted the idea that power is fluid and dynamic. It's not static. It's constantly evolving and finding new avenues of expression. And finally, I think it's crucial to remember that Bali is not a museum frozen in time. It's a living, breathing culture grappling with the challenges and opportunities of the modern world.
Beautifully said. We've explored ancient trade routes, colonial legacies, the intricate workings of the Subak system, and the fascinating stories of the Puri in Klungkung and Gianyar. It's been a journey through time, revealing how the past continues to shape Bali's present.
And I hope it inspires our listeners to continue their own exploration, whether they delve into the works of Clifford Geertz, plan a trip to Bali, or simply keep these insights in mind as they encounter different cultures and power structures. There's always more to learn.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Balinese history and power. Until next time, keep those minds curious.